In late November 1910, under the yellow lamps of Grand Central Station, a private railcar waited in the shadows. One by one, a handful of the most powerful men in America stepped onto that train. No reporters, no families, no assistants. They traveled under first names only, no last names spoken, no titles used. They told the world they were going on a simple duck hunting trip. In reality, they were going to design the system that would control the value of your money more than a century later. For 9 days, on a private island off the coast of Georgia, they would draft a plan that would quietly reshape the American economy, fuel wars, inflate bubbles, and bury future generations under mountains of debt. This is the story of that meeting, that island, and the money machine it created.
The train headed south, away from New York's noise and press, toward a destination almost no one on board dared speak out loud. Jekyll Island. At the time, it was an exclusive winter retreat for America's richest families: Morgan, Rockefeller, Astor, Vanderbilt. Hunting lodges and mansions were scattered between live oaks and marshes. In winter, the island was closed, quiet, perfect for disappearing. From the small port of Brunswick, Georgia, the men transferred to a boat and crossed the dark water in near silence. When they reached the Jekyll Island Club, regular staff were dismissed. Only a skeleton crew remained, and they were kept far from the private rooms where the real work would begin. No minutes, no official record, just 7 men, a fireplace, thick cigars, stacks of documents, and a single goal: design a new, permanent engine of credit and control.
To understand why these men needed secrecy, you have to rewind 3 years. In 1907, America had almost watched its entire banking system implode. A series of bank runs triggered chaos, small banks failed, panic spread. People lined up desperate to pull cash before their bank collapsed. There was no Federal Reserve, no official lender of last resort, no central bank. Just a network of private banks, all tied together and all vulnerable. In the end, a single man stepped forward to stop the collapse: J.P. Morgan. He gathered the top bankers in his library, locked the doors, and refused to let them leave until they pledged their own money to rescue the system. It worked, but it terrified them. They knew they couldn't rely on the personality and lifespan of one aging financier. They wanted a permanent bailout machine. The problem? Americans absolutely hated the idea of a central bank. By 1910, the idea of another central bank was political poison. Americans remembered the First and Second Bank of the United States and how fiercely they were opposed. Andrew Jackson had practically built his career on destroying the Second Bank. He called it a monster. He accused it of using credit to control ordinary people and enrich the elite. That fear never went away. Farmers in the South and West, small businesses across the country, they believed, correctly or not, that a central bank would tilt the game toward Wall Street and away from everyone else. So when the panic of 1907 made it clear the system was fragile, the bankers found themselves in a dilemma. They needed a central coordinating institution, but they couldn't dare call it a central bank, and they couldn't be seen designing it. That's why the most powerful men in American finance found themselves hiding on Jekyll Island, pretending to be on a hunting trip. After the 1907 panic, Congress created something called the National Monetary Commission to study banking reforms. Leading it was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. On paper, he was a public servant. In reality, he was deeply tied to America's financial royalty. He was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and a close ally of J.P. Morgan. Aldrich spent 2 years traveling through Europe, studying central banks in London, Paris, and Berlin. He came back convinced that the United States needed its own version, a lender of last resort, a controller of interest rates, an organizer of reserves. But he also knew that if he simply introduced a bill for a European-style central bank, the public would explode. So instead, he convened a private working group. Not economists, not farmers, not labor leaders. The people who would design America's money system were the very bankers who would later be regulated by it.
On Jekyll Island, 7 men sat down to design the blueprint. Nelson Aldrich, the political operator. Henry P. Davison from J.P. Morgan & Co., representing the Morgan banking empire. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, tied closely to the Rockefellers. Paul Warburg, a German-born banker from Kuhn, Loeb & Co., who understood European central banking better than anyone in the room. Charles Norton, from First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, of Bankers Trust, who would later run the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And A. Pyatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, the only government official among them. Together, they represented a staggering concentration of wealth and influence. Some estimates say they collectively influenced a quarter of the world's financial power. And now, inside a quiet club on a private island, they were about to design the future of American money, without voters, without transparency, and without debate.
Even on the island, the secrecy was extreme. The men agreed to address each other only by first names, not because they didn't know who they were, but to reduce the risk that staff or anyone nearby might overhear and connect the dots. If a servant heard, "Senator Aldrich, Mr. Warburg, Mr. Vanderlip," the story could leak. Nelson, Paul, Frank sounded harmless. They served some of their own meals to avoid staff entering the rooms where they worked. Windows were closed, curtains drawn. Outside, the island looked calm and empty. Inside, they debated how to redesign the country's financial plumbing. How much power should be centralized? How much should be hidden? How could they make a banker-run system look like a public service? The answer they found was as clever as it was deceptive. Call it federal, make it look decentralized, and let private banks quietly own the machinery. The first big decision was not technical, it was marketing. They knew the term central bank was a political suicide note, so Paul Warburg proposed a different name, the Federal Reserve System. Federal sounded like government, like something owned by the people. Reserve sounded cautious, safe, conservative. And system suggested decentralization, not one powerful monolith, but a network. It was the perfect disguise, public language wrapped around private control. On paper, it would look like a government creature. In practice, the regional reserve banks would be owned by private member banks. The people most affected by crises, the public, would have almost no say. The people least willing to lose money in a panic, the bankers, would sit at the control panel of the new machine.
The next decision was structure. To ease public fears about Wall Street dominance, the group proposed a system of multiple regional banks, 12 in total, one in New York, others in key cities like Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco. It sounded balanced. It sounded like power was spread across the country. But on the inside, the design guaranteed that the real influence would sit exactly where you'd expect, New York. That's where the largest banks were. That's where most of the country's reserves flowed. That's where Wall Street lived. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be corporations, with stock owned by private member banks in their districts. Those banks would choose many of the directors. In other words, the new public system was wired so that the most systemically important bankers would still be steering the ship, just with a new layer of branding and law wrapped around them.
Then came the real heart of the system, how to create money. The mechanism they agreed on was deceptively simple. When the U.S. government needs money, it issues bonds, IOUs that promise repayment with interest. The Federal Reserve, through its regional banks, can buy those bonds. But it doesn't pay with existing savings. It creates new money with accounting entries. On the Fed's balance sheet, the bond is recorded as an asset. The new dollars it issues become liabilities. Those dollars then flow into the banking system and the broader economy. The government gets to spend, the banks get more reserves, and the public gets more debt plus inflation over time. This is the engine that allowed debt to expand from almost nothing in 1913 to tens of trillions today, with almost no public debate about the basic architecture.
On the surface, this arrangement looks like a clever way to smooth crises and fund government spending. But underneath, it hides a cost that compounds relentlessly: inflation. When new money is created without equivalent new productive value, the total pool of dollars grows. Over time, each individual dollar buys less. The first recipients of new money, governments, big banks, large asset holders, benefit because they spend it while prices are still relatively low. By the time that money filters down to wages and savings accounts, prices have already adjusted upward. It's not an explicit tax you vote on. It's a silent one that slowly strips purchasing power from savers, retirees, and anyone who holds cash. And it's baked into the design, a side effect of a system that allows money creation through debt permanently. When the Jekyll Island Group finished their design, Senator Aldrich took the plan back to Washington. On paper, it became known as the Aldrich Plan, and the reaction was hostile. Progressives and populists quickly saw it as a Wall Street scheme. Rural politicians distrusted it. Their voters didn't want a system that smelled like banker control, wrapped in federal language. The plan stalled. Publicly, it looked like a failure, but behind the scenes, nothing fundamental changed. The blueprint was still there. It simply needed a new salesman, a new brand, and a new political moment. That moment arrived 2 years later, with a different president and a more careful marketing strategy. The architecture of Jekyll Island would survive. It would just come back wearing different clothes.
In 1912, Woodrow Wilson was elected president, campaigning as a reformer suspicious of big business. That image was crucial. The bankers understood that they could not be the visible authors of the new system. Instead, a new version of the Jekyll Island Plan was put forward by Democratic Congressmen Carter Glass and Robert Owen. The core design, regional banks, private ownership, bond-based money creation, remained, but now it was wrapped in progressive language. The bill was framed as a way to tame Wall Street, not empower it. The name Aldrich vanished from the branding. The public saw Glass-Owen instead, and a president who promised to stand up to concentrated power. Behind the curtain, many of the same financial interests quietly supported it. The script had changed. The actors behind the scenes had not.
In December 1913, with many members of Congress already home for the holidays, the Federal Reserve Act came up for a vote. Debates had been heated for months. Some lawmakers warned it would hand control of credit to a small elite. Others argued that without it, financial panics would continue to wreck the economy. In the end, the act passed, both houses. On December 23rd, President Wilson signed it into law. Few people on Main Street understood what had just happened. There was no national referendum, no simple explanation of how money would now be created, who would own the new reserve banks, or how debt and inflation would evolve. In a quiet office, on the eve of Christmas, the United States handed control of its monetary architecture to a hybrid entity, public in appearance, deeply private in operation. Almost immediately, the power of the new system was tested. Within a year, Europe plunged into World War I. By 1917, the United States joined the conflict and needed enormous sums to fund troops, weapons, and logistics.
Before the Federal Reserve, that kind of borrowing would have hit hard limits. Investors would demand high interest rates, and the appetite for government debt would have been finite. With the Fed in place, there was always a buyer for U.S. bonds. The central bank could create reserves, purchase government debt, and keep money flowing. Between 1917 and 1919, U.S. federal debt multiplied several times over. The war ended, but the habit did not. A pattern had been set. In crisis, the Fed would create money, the government would borrow, and the long-term cost would quietly shift into the future, onto taxpayers and savers who had never been in the room where the original design was drafted.
In the 1920s, the Federal Reserve helped fuel one of the most famous booms in financial history. Credit expanded, interest rates were kept low for long stretches, new financial products spread through banks and brokers. Ordinary people were encouraged to buy stocks on margin, borrowing to speculate. Cities sparkled, radios, cars, and consumer goods multiplied. It felt like a permanent new era of prosperity. But underneath, leverage was piling up. When the Fed later tightened credit and sentiment shifted, the reversal was brutal. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression followed. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment spiked. For everyday Americans, it looked like a total system failure. For those who understood the mechanics, it was a violent lesson. A central bank powerful enough to amplify booms is also powerful enough, intentionally or not, to deepen busts.
Nearly a century later, the pattern rhymed. In the early 2000s, interest rates were kept low for years. Credit flowed easily into housing. Banks invented complex securities that sliced and repackaged mortgages. Prices surged. Homeowners felt rich. The system felt safe. Until it didn't. When the housing bubble burst in 2008, the crisis threatened to freeze the entire global financial system. Once again, the Federal Reserve stepped in as rescuer. It slashed interest rates to near zero and created trillions of dollars to buy bonds and stabilize markets. A decade later, during the COVID shock of 2020, the response was even more extreme. Unprecedented money creation in an incredibly short time. Asset prices roared back. But so did inflation. Just like after World War I, just like after previous expansions, the immediate crisis passed, while the long-term cost quietly accumulated on the balance sheets of governments and in the shrinking purchasing power of everyday money.
To be fair, the men on Jekyll Island were not stupid. They correctly understood that a fragmented, uncoordinated banking system was vulnerable to panics. They understood that the ability to pool reserves and act quickly could prevent cascading failures. In many crises, central banks really do stop short-term chaos. That part of the design worked. But they also built a machine with built-in temptations. If governments know that there is always a buyer of last resort for their bonds, the discipline to limit debt weakens. If large banks know that in a meltdown, liquidity will appear, risk-taking tends to grow in the good years. The result is a system that looks stable most of the time, but periodically produces enormous shocks, followed by even more intervention, even more debt, even more dependence on the very institution created in that closed room in 1910.
Today, the numbers are almost too large to grasp. Trillions in government debt, trillions more on central bank balance sheets. It raises a simple question: why not just pay it down? The uncomfortable answer is that in a system where money is created through debt, fully paying off that debt would also shrink the money supply dramatically. Dollars are born when loans and bonds are issued. If those claims are retired faster than new ones are created, the total pool of money shrinks. That leads to deflation, falling prices, collapsing incomes, and widespread defaults. No politician wants to preside over that. So the system lurches forward instead, rolling old debt into new, borrowing more to service the interest on what already exists. The machine built in 1910 was not designed for clean endings. It was designed to roll and roll and roll.
Over more than a century, the Federal Reserve System has produced clear winners and invisible losers. Asset owners, people and institutions who hold stocks, real estate, and bonds, tend to benefit when new money pushes asset prices upward over decades. Large financial institutions profit from their central role in distributing credit and trading securities. Governments gain the ability to spend beyond what they collect in taxes, smoothing political pain. On the other side are workers whose wages don't fully keep up with the rising cost of living. Savers who keep their wealth in cash or simple deposits and watch its purchasing power erode. Young people trying to enter housing markets inflated by years of easy money. None of this feels like a law passed in a single bill. It feels like the economy. But behind the scenes, it flows from the basic rules quietly written on a private island in 1910. Textbooks and official narratives often present the Federal Reserve as a neutral technocratic institution simply managing the economy. The origin story is usually softened, created to stabilize finance, protect depositors, and smooth the business cycle. The secret 9-day meeting, the first-name-only agreements, the heavy involvement of private bankers, those details are usually missing or treated as trivial. But money is not neutral. Whoever designs the rules of money shapes the structure of power. The fact that those rules were drafted by a small, unelected group of men representing enormous financial interests matters. It doesn't mean every decision a century later is secretly scripted on their behalf. It does mean the foundation was not laid in a transparent, democratic way. It was engineered, in private, by people with very specific priorities.
If the origins were so concentrated and the outcomes so skewed, why hasn't the system been fundamentally changed? Partly, it's inertia. Over a century, entire layers of finance, pensions, government programs, and international trade have been built on top of this architecture. Unwinding it would mean rethinking everything, from how banks operate to how governments budget. Partly, it's power. Institutions that benefit from the current structure, large banks, major asset managers, governments, have little incentive to support radical change. And partly, it's complexity. Most people are busy surviving their daily lives. They don't have time to study how money is born from bonds and balance sheets. As long as paychecks arrive and cards swipe, the deeper plumbing remains invisible. Exactly as it was in 1910, when ordinary citizens had no idea what was happening on a quiet island off Georgia's coast.
It's tempting to see Jekyll Island as the place where a permanent spell was cast over the American economy. The reality is more subtle. The island meeting didn't freeze history, it set a direction. It locked in certain habits: debt-backed money, central coordination, private influence embedded in public language. Since then, the world has changed dramatically. Wars, depressions, technological revolutions, globalization, digital finance. Yet, the basic outline remains: a central institution, empowered to create money by purchasing government and financial assets, steering crises from above. Jekyll Island is not just a location on a map. It's a symbol of how the modern monetary order was born. Not in a town hall, but in a secluded club, by people who understood the power of architecture better than most. When you look at your bank balance, your paycheck, the price of food, rent, or a home, you're seeing the downstream effects of decisions made inside this architecture.
the long drift of inflation, the periodic crises and rescues, the steady climb of government debt, the widening gap between asset owners and everyone else. None of that can be explained purely by bad luck or random cycles. It's the behavior of a system that was optimized to protect credit markets and large institutions first, and to consider ordinary households indirectly, through averages and statistics. Understanding this doesn't magically change your mortgage rate or shrink prices at the grocery store, but it does strip away the illusion that money is a natural force like the weather. It's not. It's a set of rules. And those rules were written, quite literally, behind closed doors.
The 7 men who boarded that train in 1910 are long gone. The club they met in is now a historic landmark. The rail car is a museum piece, but the framework they designed is still very much alive. When a crisis hits and headlines announce a new lending program, a new bond purchase scheme, or a sudden shift in interest rates, you're watching the descendants of that design at work. The meeting on Jekyll Island ended after 9 days. The system it created never clocked out. It shapes how governments borrow, how markets react, and how your savings behave. You don't have to love it, you don't have to hate it, but you should know where it came from. Because once you understand that a handful of men traveling under false names to a private island helped decide how your money works, you'll never look at a simple dollar bill quite the same way again.